A tariff is essentially a tax placed on goods that are brought into a country from abroad. When a government imposes a tariff, it makes imported products more expensive, which can encourage consumers to buy domestically produced alternatives instead. Tariffs have been used for centuries as a way to shape trade, protect local jobs, and sometimes to send a political message to other nations. In the United States, tariffs have served multiple purposes. They can shield domestic industries from foreign competition, generate revenue for the government, or act as a bargaining chip in international negotiations. The debate over tariffs is as old as the country itself, with arguments about whether they help or hurt the broader economy. The Trump administration brought tariffs back to the center of economic policy, claiming that countries like China were engaging in unfair trade practices, such as dumping cheap goods and stealing intellectual property, that had devastated American manufacturing towns and cost millions of jobs. For President Trump, tariffs were more than just taxes. They were a strategic weapon. He used them to pressure trading partners into renegotiating deals that he argued were unfair to the U.S., and to reassert American economic strength on the world stage. This marked a dramatic shift away from the decades-long consensus favoring free trade and open markets. The administration argued that persistent trade deficits, where the U.S. imported far more than it exported, were a sign of economic weakness and vulnerability. Officials also claimed that foreign governments manipulated their currencies and markets, posing not just an economic challenge, but a national security threat that demanded a forceful response, including sweeping tariffs. To justify these actions, the Trump administration relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, passed in 1977. This law gives the president broad authority to act in response to what are deemed extraordinary threats to the nation's security, including those arising from international trade. Trump's use of IEEPA to impose tariffs was unprecedented and sparked intense debate. Critics argued that it stretched the law beyond its original intent, raising serious questions about the limits of presidential power and the role of Congress in trade policy. This legal and political battle would ultimately test the boundaries of executive authority, setting the stage for a high-stakes showdown over who controls America's economic future, and how far a president can go in reshaping the rules of global trade. Critics argued Trump's use of IEEPA for tariffs was an overreach, bypassing Congress's constitutional role in trade. They said IEEPA was meant for sudden crises, not chronic trade deficits, and that other laws already govern trade remedies. Businesses hit by tariffs described soaring costs and uncertainty, warning of inflation and disrupted supply chains. The administration countered that decades of unfair trade practices were an extraordinary threat, and IEEPA's broad language gave the president needed flexibility. The legal fight centered on whether the president could declare a national emergency over long-standing economic issues. The stage was set for a high-stakes court battle over the scope of executive power in trade. Federal courts quickly weighed in, with a district judge ruling Trump's use of IEEPA for broad tariffs unlawful. The court found that chronic trade issues didn't qualify as the kind of emergency IEEPA was designed to address. The administration appealed, warning that limiting presidential authority would weaken America's ability to respond to global threats. The appellate court upheld the lower ruling, stating the president's power in trade is significant but not unlimited. The judges allowed tariffs to remain temporarily, giving the government time to appeal to the Supreme Court. The decision was a major blow to Trump's trade agenda and set up a final showdown at the nation's highest court. The legal and economic stakes had never been higher. The Trump administration urgently appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing that the lower court's rulings threatened presidential authority and national security. Officials warned that without IEEPA, the U.S. would be defenseless against unfair foreign trade practices. The Supreme Court agreed to fast-track the case, recognizing its profound constitutional and economic implications. The administration insisted courts should defer to the president's judgment on national emergencies, especially in foreign policy. Critics countered that unchecked executive power would undermine the separation of powers and invite abuse. The business world and global markets braced for a decision that would define the limits of presidential power for years. The stage was set for a landmark ruling. On October 2, 2025, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, ruled Trump's use of IEEPA for broad tariffs unlawful. The majority held that IEEPA was meant for sudden, specific crises, not for long-term trade policy or chronic economic issues. The court said allowing such use would give the president unchecked power to tax and bypass Congress. The dissent argued for broad presidential discretion, warning the ruling could weaken future presidents in economic crises. The decision clarified that sweeping tariffs require congressional action or use of other, more specific trade laws. The ruling was a major check on executive power and a reaffirmation of the separation of powers. The legal battle was over, but the fight over trade policy was far from settled. The Supreme Court's decision sent shockwaves through Washington, leaving the government scrambling to process massive refunds, potentially as much as $80 billion for 2025 alone. Agencies braced for an unprecedented administrative challenge, as thousands of businesses and individuals rushed to file claims, hoping to recoup money paid under the now invalid tariffs. The Treasury Department faced mounting pressure to clarify the refund process, while lawmakers debated how to address the sudden fiscal gap. For businesses that had paid tariffs, the prospect of refunds was a welcome relief. Yet, the years of uncertainty had already disrupted planning, delayed investments, and forced many companies to rethink their supply chains. Some firms had shifted production overseas, while others struggled to adapt to rapidly changing trade rules. The loss of tariff revenue created a fiscal headache for policymakers, with estimates of a $2 trillion shortfall over the next decade. This sudden gap threatened to complicate budget negotiations, potentially forcing cuts to public programs or new sources of revenue. Economists warned that the government's ability to fund infrastructure, healthcare, and education could be at risk. For consumers, the end of tariffs promised long-awaited relief from higher prices, especially as inflation remained a concern for many households. Lower import costs could mean cheaper goods on store shelves, from electronics to everyday groceries, offering some respite after years of rising costs. However, some domestic industries, once shielded by tariffs, now faced renewed foreign competition. American manufacturers in sectors like steel, textiles, and machinery worried about job losses and shrinking market share as cheaper imports flooded the market. Despite these challenges, markets remained resilient. Investors were buoyed by optimism in technology and hopes for supportive monetary policy, but the specter of trade instability lingered, making some sectors more volatile than others. The Supreme Court's ruling forced a difficult trade-off: lower prices for consumers, but new challenges for American manufacturers and workers. The balance between affordable goods and protecting domestic jobs became a central debate. As the dust settled, the economic landscape was shifting. Uncertainty still clouded the future of U.S. trade, leaving businesses, consumers, and policymakers alike searching for stability in a rapidly changing world. The Supreme Court's decision deepened the national divide over trade. Supporters of Trump's tariffs saw the ruling as judicial overreach, undermining efforts to protect American industry. They argued tariffs were necessary to confront unfair foreign practices and rebuild U.S. manufacturing. Critics hailed the decision as a victory for the rule of law and economic sanity, warning that tariffs hurt American consumers and businesses. Polls showed most Americans opposed broad tariffs, citing higher costs and global supply chain disruptions. Free trade advocates called for targeted action through international bodies, not sweeping protectionism. The debate over America's trade future was more polarized than ever. The Trump administration quickly pivoted, vowing to maintain tariffs in the face of mounting global pressure and domestic debate. Determined to protect American industries, officials doubled down on their commitment to reshaping the nation's trade relationships, signaling a new era of economic nationalism. They began using other legal tools like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allowed the president to impose tariffs on the grounds of national security. This rarely used provision became a central weapon in the administration's trade arsenal. New investigations and tariffs on products from semiconductors and electronics to steel and aluminum were launched, targeting industries seen as vital to America's future competitiveness. Even sectors like furniture, once considered safe from trade wars, were swept up in the administration's aggressive stance, sending ripples through global supply chains and domestic markets. But the Supreme Court's ruling reasserted Congress's primary role in trade. reminding the nation that the power to regulate commerce ultimately rests with lawmakers, not the executive branch alone. This decision made it harder for presidents to act unilaterally, placing new checks on executive authority and forcing a reconsideration of how far presidential power can reach in trade matters. Future administrations will need to work with Congress, forging bipartisan coalitions and negotiating compromises to enact broad trade policies. Alternatively, they may be forced to use more targeted trade laws, focusing on specific industries or products, rather than sweeping measures. This shift could slow the path to sweeping tariffs, making it more difficult to enact rapid, large-scale changes to U.S. trade policy. The decision left the philosophical divide between protectionism and free trade unresolved, with both sides continuing to argue over the best path for America's economic future. The administration's determination to find new legal avenues and the ongoing search for creative strategies ensures that trade policy will remain a battleground for years to come. As a result, trade policy continues to spark heated debates, protests, and political maneuvering, reflecting its deep impact on American society. Businesses and consumers remain caught in the crossfire, facing uncertainty over prices, supply chains, and the future of their livelihoods. All of this is part of a historic struggle over America's economic destiny, with the stakes higher than ever for workers, companies, and families across the nation. The future of U.S. trade will be shaped by this ongoing battle, as leaders and lawmakers grapple with the challenges of a rapidly changing global economy. Ultimately, the tug-of-war between executive ambition and legal limits will define the next chapter in America's trade story.